How did badminton become an Olympic sport? A simple question, one I thought I knew the answer to. I mean, if anyone asked me, I had all the right talking points. Badminton first applied to become an Olympic sport in 1964. In 1972 in Munich it was a demonstration event. Then the badminton world split, halting proceedings. The subsequent unification brought with it the open era of badminton. The open era led to a fast expansion of the badminton world, helping badminton become an exhibition event at the Seoul Olympics in 1988, with its full participation set for the Barcelona Olympics in 1992. I felt it was already quite an interesting story, and with this year's Olympics not too far away, I thought, wouldn't it be a cool video idea to bring you that story? Of course, to do this, I knew I had to do a little more research. I knew the basics, but nothing too specific. However, what I unearthed was a story far larger than I ever anticipated. So large in fact I felt it best to break it into 3 parts. So prepare yourself everyone for a story filled with drama, fighting, political strife, boycotts and even lawsuits. This is the story of badminton's 3-decade journey to the Olympic Games. This story begins 60 years ago in 1964 on a bleak and drizzly day in Switzerland. The International Badminton Federation, IBF, were holding their annual general meeting. It was in this meeting that a proposal was put forward that badminton should try to become an Olympic sport. Although the IBF was 30 years old in 1964, this proposal was made because badminton was finally in a position where they could claim to be a global sport, with federations under them from pretty much all corners of the world. In 1934, when the IBF was first formed, it had 9 associations attached to it. In 1964, that number had risen to 60, with federations in 5 continents. That, combined with the numerous tournaments that were regularly organised, no problems with professionalism, something which was incredibly important as the Olympics was strictly for amateurs back then, and that badminton was also part of other large multi-sports events like the Asian Games and Commonwealth Games, well, the IBF felt they ticked all the right boxes to become an Olympic sport. It should come as no surprise then that this proposal was met with great enthusiasm. Becoming an Olympic sport is a huge deal, as with it comes exposure, funding, and it can be used as a springboard to expanding the sport massively. And it started quite positively for badminton, as usually with anything related to the International Olympic Committee, IOC, it takes a long time to get anything moving forward. However, for badminton, around the end of the decade, it was already decided that it would become a demonstration sport at the 1972 Munich Olympics. The West German Olympic Committee granted the IBF the use of a newly built volleyball hall for the whole of Monday 4th, 1972. This was fantastic news for the IBF, who in the remaining time were focusing their efforts on not just planning for the event, but how to make the most of such a situation. Due to the 1-day limit and only 2 courts available, the IBF decided to restrict the number of entrants to just 24. For perspective, that's less than what would make up one Olympic event these days. Another restriction was the events that would be played, and it was an odd choice. The IBF decided to play men's singles, women's singles, men's doubles and mixed doubles. Women's doubles was to be left out. The reason for this has never been publicly stated. Most say it's because of time and limited entrants, but I believe it was because of the excitement and popularity of women's doubles being the lowest. But remember, the IBF wanted this demonstration event to showcase the very best of badminton, and the 4 events chosen they felt would do just that. Also, the IBF were incredibly keen to have mixed doubles being played because it showed something that no other sport had, men and women playing equally. The IBF knew this could be a unique selling point of badminton. Another thing the IBF did to ensure this would be an amazing event was to form a selection committee whose job it would be to invite the world's best players. Invites had been sent out to the federations of 17 countries, and it was from the responses that the selection committee would choose who would participate. All preparations were going smoothly, and as a result there was a real buzz of excitement leading up to the 1972 Games. There was quite the consensus amongst BDF officials that this could be the gateway for badminton to become a fully fledged Olympic sport by the 1976 Olympics in Montreal. However, just 1 year before the Munich Games were to start in Luxembourg at an IOC meeting, the IOC made some news publicly known that dampened this positivity somewhat. In that meeting, the IOC went on record that they were actually looking to lessen the number of Olympic events, not increase it. And they were going to do this by removing sports that, quote, do not appear to have a sufficiently large world following. Now, whilst I did just say this dampened the IBF's positivity, it didn't kill it. In fact, the IBF quickly saw this as an opportunity. They felt that if the IOC did remove some sports, that it opened up the door for others, and badminton could be one of those, as it fit all the criteria the IOC were looking for. I've already mentioned them: the global reach, the competitions, the amateur aspect, but there was also another. Badminton was an incredibly cheap sport to house at the Olympics. It didn't require much space, could be fit into most arenas or halls already built, and on top of this, the IBF and subsequent federations were willing to fund the cost themselves. Although, having read some of the reports from the 1971 AGM, there was one interesting thing that came out, something that relates to the issue of cost and tells a somewhat different story. At that AGM, Mr. Hertz, the chairman of the tournament committee, raised the concern that the cost of running the Olympic event was quite considerable and could be ill-afforded from the normal funds of the federation. The cost? £500. Doesn't sound like much, but back in the early 70s, for an amateur organisation with no sponsors, this was quite a lot of money. Suggestions were made to alleviate this problem, and one which garnered the most interest was from a Mr. Verstock, who said he had already got approval for the production of a number of stickers to advertise the tournament. And although the stickers were to only be sold at 9p each, it was revealed that he had already received an order of 7,000 of them, a quantity which came to a total of £630, easily covering the Olympic £500 overhead. It's maybe because of this that the IBF could so confidently say that badminton was a sport where cost wasn't to be a concern. This cost element, plus the other unique selling points, were what the BDF used when they attended an IOC meeting that was held in February 1972, during the Winter Olympics in Japan. Talking about badminton at the 1976 Montreal Games, they made assurances that not only can Montreal host the badminton event due to enough space, but once again they emphasised that badminton is a sport that meets IOC criteria, as they have participants and champions from all over the world. Sadly though, even with the Canadian Badminton Association's strong backing and support, badminton was not added to the Montreal Games. In fact, it wasn't even discussed, with the IOC saying that this was, quote, because of the overcharged agenda, the committee did not have an opportunity to discuss your application again. The IOC did say, however, that following the demonstration event in Munich, badminton's application will be properly reviewed. In May 1972, the invited players were confirmed, and it was a who's who of the world's best at the time, including many All England champions. By July, the draws were made and published in the World Badminton magazine. What's also noteworthy about this particular issue of the World Badminton magazine is that the IBF, despite the deferring of the IOC on their application and the IOC's public statement they were looking to downsize the games, they were incredibly positive on becoming a fully fledged Olympic sport by 1976. Badminton's tremendous athletic attributes would shine through, they said. And well, at those Munich Games, they certainly did. The badminton display was fantastic, as to be expected with the world's best playing, and the 3,000 fans in attendance thoroughly enjoyed the day's action. The atmosphere inside the hall was great, and what added to it was that for the first time in badminton history, electronic scoreboards were used. This made it much easier for the spectators to follow the score, as well as who was serving. One spectator in particular was of interest to the IBF, and that was the IOC president Avery Brundage, who came to watch the event, enjoying the matches and talking with officials and others in the hall. There was only one negative to the whole badminton event, and that was that although promised by the German Olympic Committee, there was no press or TV coverage for the event. But aside from this, the IBF saw this demonstration event as a massive success, and with the IOC set to meet during the Games, they felt they were in as good a position as any to become an Olympic sport. Well, until the IOC once again deferred talking about badminton until their next meeting in Lausanne in December. The IBF weren't going to let this dampen their spirits. They had just put on a fantastic tournament, showing their capability to run an Olympic event. They had made the connections with the IOC, and they had plans to develop badminton even further. To them, it seemed that becoming an Olympic sport was just a matter of time. But little did they know, on the horizon, an issue was brewing that would go on to shape badminton for almost the next decade. October 1972. The Olympics had been a success and the IBF were pushing forward, trying to expand the game to further strengthen their position in time for that IOC meeting in December. And one big way in which the IBF felt this was possible was if two huge countries would join them. Those two countries were the USSR and the People's Republic of China, which, moving forward for ease, I will simply call China. In the 1972 December issue of the World Badminton magazine, this desire was printed on the front page. We sincerely hope that before 1973 is ended, that both countries may have applied for membership and be elected. Whilst that line has a lovely sentiment to it, it also gives you a clue to a question you might already have. And that is, if the BDF wanted these two nations to join, then why didn't they just invite them? Well, the answer to that is quite simple. The IBF statutes and regulations clearly stated that the IBF will not actively invite members. It can only accept applications from which membership to the IBF is voted on. This leads to the obvious follow-up question. How come the USSR or China hadn't already applied? The answer to this question is incredibly important. It will drive a lot of the narrative for a large chunk of this video, so I'm going to lay it out now. I must also preface it with two quick things. One, I will only be focusing on China. You'll understand why soon enough. And two, this is quite a nuanced and deep subject that goes way beyond the realms of badminton. As such, I will only really focus on the bare elements that are relevant to this story. And viewer, you must try and keep what I'm about to say in your mind, as like I said, it'll underlay a lot of the story moving forward. I'm going to explain this through a mini story. In the 1920s, the China National Amateur Athletic Federation was formed, and from within that, the National Badminton Association of the Republic of China, NBA-ROC, was born. Originally, the NBA-ROC's headquarters were in Shanghai, on the mainland of China, but in the 1940s they moved to Taiwan. In 1957, they became an affiliated member of the IBF. Now, for some of you watching who might be like me before I made this video, it is important to note that the Republic of China is known today as Chinese Taipei or Taiwan. Back in China, there was the All China Sports Federation, which oversaw many of the sporting federations of China, including the Badminton Association of the People's Republic of China, BAPRC. The All China Sports Federation refused to join any international federation that recognised Taiwanese organisations, which the IBF clearly did. The IBF were willing to accept both associations, as they weren't made up of just countries, but different federations. The IBF even showed that two federations from the same country can coexist within their federation. At the time, Germany was split into West Germany and the German Democratic Republic, both with their own badminton federations. Both of them were members of the IBF. But this didn't budge the viewpoint of China, who were insistent, saying that this issue was a domestic matter, not one for international sports bodies to solve. The crux of it was that it was the political stance of China that stopped any progression towards the CBA-PRC joining the IBF. So, that's a very quick rundown of that whole situation. Whilst they weren't a member of the IBF, China were still involved in badminton in a big way. Throughout this period of the very early 70s, China did many tours of other countries and also housed exhibitions and friendly matches within China. One particular tour of note was in 1972 when Canada toured China, playing a number of friendly matches. It was noted how China were excellent in the singles events, but not so the doubles. But more importantly, it was noted just how popular badminton was. The matches were played in front of a packed house every time, showing the potential market within China. Also, they had the infrastructure in place to house many big tournaments, something which we definitely see today. It was during these tours where China did start to form some alliances with other federations under the IBF. Ceylon, Pakistan and even Japan were amongst them. In fact, it was Ceylon who first mentioned to the IBF in 1971 that they should try and reach out to China more and encourage them to join. And it was these alliances that would make themselves very known shortly. But before that, the IBF were solely focusing their efforts on getting the Olympic bid. They were working incredibly closely with the Canadian Badminton Association, as the 76 Games were to be held there, in Montreal. The IBF were especially interested in Montreal being the games to kickstart badminton's Olympic journey, saying it would be a heaven start for badminton. This was mainly due to the fact that Canada not only had great facilities capable of housing badminton, but because the Canadian BA were one of the founding federations of the IBF back in 1934, they were wholeheartedly on side with the IBF and would do everything in their power to make the event a success. The IBF was so keen for the Olympics that the Honorary Secretary at the time, Herbert Scheel, wrote a letter to the IOC explicitly to push the badminton agenda. But regardless of this big push, via a direct letter to the IBF from IOC Technical Director Artur Takac, the IOC decided not to discuss the question of new sports for the Olympic programme. The whole matter was to be carefully restudied by the IOC Programme Commission and submitted to the IOC in one of the next meetings. So, sadly for the IBF, for the third time now, it was deferred to a later date. But as has been the case with the deferrings, it did come with a ray of hope. This time the IBF were invited to the Olympic Congress to be held in Varna, Bulgaria from October 1st to October 4th, 1973, an invitation the IBF of course accepted. It was not too long after receiving that letter from the IOC that the agenda for the 35th IBF AGM was circulated, an AGM that was to be held in London in July. The agenda was filled with the usual law changes, financial matters and tournament regulations, but also amongst it was something else, something rather interesting and potentially very controversial. It was 3 proposals from those allies of China I mentioned not too long ago, Ceylon, Japan and Pakistan. The beginning of their proposals wasn't too out of the ordinary. They put forward that the Badminton Association of the People's Republic of China should be invited to the BWF. Like I say, nothing out of the ordinary. But it was the second part which, at the time, was seen as totally shocking, and that, if necessary to achieve that, the National Badminton Association of the Republic of China should be expelled. Quite the shocking proposal, and when July 3rd came around and the IBF held their AGM, it was naturally discussed at length. The IBF once again held onto the viewpoint that federations are never asked to join, but must apply themselves, something China themselves hadn't done. And I think it was for this reason, plus the fact it was early days within this particular issue, that the proposal was voted against substantially 50-0 in favour of not expelling the National Badminton Association of the Republic of China. However, the fact this proposal was even made in the first place did lead the NBA ROC to do something that they felt could potentially ease the tensions, change their name. They changed it from the National Badminton Association of the Republic of China to the Taiwan Badminton Association. They thought the main contention was the fact that China was in the name, in a way showing they spoke for all of China. They hoped this name change would show that that's not the case, with it easing China's stance towards them and thus potentially joining the IBF. Even with this act from Taiwan and such an overwhelming vote against the proposal, during discussions the IBF did have a lot of criticism levelled their way. Some criticised the IBF for accepting Taiwan in the first place under the old name, especially as knowledge of China's stance was available. The criticism was taken further by the Iranian delegate, as they were to host the next Asian Games in Tehran the following year, where the Taiwanese Badminton Association were to be invited. An invitation which ultimately never happened. In a crazy turn of events, on September 18th, 1973, the Asian Games Federation Executive Committee voted to expel Taiwan and invite China. This matter was quite a tempestuous one, as whilst Japanese and Pakistani delegates backed this decision, Malaysian, Indonesian, Thai and Taiwanese delegates were so disgusted with the decision they all stormed out of the meeting. It was with the rather rough end to 1973 that, heading into 1974, the situation that was quickly being dubbed the China problem was starting to become a real issue. There was even news from the Olympic Congress in October of 1973 that this situation with China was causing them concern. At that same Olympic Congress, the issue was discussed further. The Japanese Olympic Committee said China's Olympic Committee should get Olympic recognition, even though they only had 4 out of the 5 required national sports federations to join the IOC. The problem, as had been from the start, was that China refused to allow sports participation in sports where Taiwan is recognised. The Taiwanese Badminton Association's name change to ease the tensions had done nothing, although it was noted by the IBF at that Olympic Congress that they wished more Taiwanese sporting federations also made this name change, feeling it could help. Because of these sorts of discussions and murmurs, for a fourth consecutive time, any discussion on badminton's inclusion in the Olympics was deferred. It seemed less and less likely that badminton would be a part of the 1976 Games. There was a slim hope that it could be there as another demonstration event, but when I say slim, I mean very slim. However, later in 1974, something went down that would not just torpedo badminton's 76 hopes, but potentially their Olympic hopes, period. June 1974, the agenda for that year's AGM was released, and within it was something unprecedented: the removal of Taiwan for the admittance of China. Now, wait up, hold on, you're probably wondering, didn't that get proposed in 1973? Well, yes it did, but in 1974 there was one major difference. This time China had put in an application to join the IBF, but with the very important caveat that their approval must coincide with Taiwan's expulsion. This was, by their own words, because the BA of the People's Republic of China claims that it is the sole national organisation governing the game in all China. It is claimed includes the Taiwan province. And with that very important caveat, 1 month later, the meeting was set to happen. A meeting that would go down as one of the most contentious in IBF history. July 2nd, 1974, London. The 36th AGM of the IBF took place. 40 national organisations attended this, one of the most packed AGMs in recent memory. And that was all because of one huge agenda item: China's application and Taiwan's expulsion. I can't stress how monumentous this item was. I think the only way I can really express this properly is by telling you one other agenda item: the formation of the World Championships. Yes, a proposal for a World Championships was to be discussed, yet everyone was talking and reporting on the China-Taiwan situation. But that was sport at the time. It was becoming increasingly political. The August 1974 edition of the World Badminton magazine had an article all about this, saying how many sporting federations were being influenced on how they vote by their country's governments. Some tours were being cancelled out of fear of political backlash, and with joining the IBF, it wasn't just China in a governmental stranglehold. Other federations often had to get governmental approval before applying to become a member. These political situations were getting so bad that Singapore had to cancel its World Invitation Tournament because of advice from its non-badminton authorities. This sort of politics in sports was very much present at that 1974 IBF AGM. The proposals and applications put forward were discussed for 5.5 hours. From 11 AM to 4:30 PM, nothing else was discussed but China and Taiwan. The real sad part is that most of the discussions weren't even about badminton, but about the countries themselves, often divulging into personal attacks. It was a real mess. At the end of it, a vote was had, and to pass, a majority vote of 75% had to happen. It failed. But that wasn't the end of it. The New Zealand BA proposed that China must resubmit their application, but with the proposition of Taiwan's removal taken out. This idea sparked even more heated arguments, until, fed up with it all, IBF chairman Ferry Sonneville, in one of his last acts as chairman, put it to a vote. 42-6 in favour was the result. That should have been the end of it, but this decision by Ferry Sonneville sparked backlash amongst some federations who contested the chairman's ruling. Backlash which would go on to have some repercussions in years to come. That 1974 AGM was a contentious one, mainly because of the China-Taiwan situation. There was another similarly contentious issue addressed, one that also had a direct link to the Olympics, but its time to shine in this story will have to wait. Back to the Olympics, 1974 marked 10 years since the IBF had first made an Olympic bid, and as you can tell, progression had been slow. This was mainly due to the IOC continuously deferring the discussion, combined with their stance that they wanted to downsize the Olympics, not upsize it. Another spanner in the works was the one I have just spoken about, the China problem. But although in a way these two issues were out of the IBF's hands, Plus, it wasn't like they weren't trying. The lack of progress caused some grumblings from a number of people from within the IBF. To try and ease some of these grumblings, as well as simply progress badminton's position for Olympic inclusion, at a council meeting in London in 1974, the IBF decided to affiliate itself with the General Assembly of International Federations, or GAIF for short. This was a relatively new federation at the time, only 5 or 6 years old, but its main aim was to help sports not currently part of the Olympics to become one. The perfect partner for the IBF. And they made the most of it, constantly trying to push badminton's agenda and move it along. But even with the GAIF on board, trying to get the IOC to make a decision was taking agonisingly long. In fact, on September 25, 1974, the president of the International Softball Federation wrote a letter to Lord Killanin of the GAIF to air his grievances at how slow their process is. This lack of speed meant that any chance of badminton being involved in the 1976 Olympics were over. The 1980 Olympics were now the new target. (1975). It was a year that, according to the IBF, will be looked back on as the year when the biggest ever changes in the general conduct of top-class badminton first took place. And whilst, yes, they were most certainly right, 1975 was also a year that saw those small cracks in the IBF become chasms. Chasms which would ultimately push back badminton's Olympic inclusion considerably. To see how and why this happened, we must look no further than the agenda for that year's AGM. I am starting to sense a pattern here. You shouldn't be too surprised when I show you the title above the article relating to this agenda. The China question again. Yes, for the third consecutive AGM there was a proposal for the inclusion of China and the expulsion of Taiwan. But just like how over the last 2 years the whole situation had grown, somehow this was the case heading into this 1975 AGM. In fact, the situation had escalated so far that the meetings were to be split over 2 days. On the 30th of June there would be an extraordinary general meeting, EGM, to discuss the rules and regulations around what the Asia Badminton Confederation, ABC, did during their own EGM at the Asian Games the year previous. What did they do? Well, they expelled Taiwan and brought in China, a decision which was made against their own rules, as they weren't allowed to affiliate with any federation not already a part of the IBF. And on July 1st, the IBF would hold their regular AGM. At the EGM, there was a vote cast on changing the rule which the ABC broke. Subsequently, this was defeated, mainly because Pakistan, who had initially worded the proposal, changed it so much that it didn't make much sense. At the AGM, once again the proposal for bringing China into the IBF and expelling Taiwan was defeated, the same result as had been the previous 2 years. But with this result, a new issue did arise: voting. More specifically, voting allowances and majority required. Under the current system, the voting allowances varied. For some federations, their vote counted as 1, but for some, their vote counted as 2 or even 3. It seems like length of time under the IBF plays a role in deciding this, but I can't speculate more. But looking at the voting rights of the countries at the time, it seems fair to me. But one country, one vote wasn't the only bone of contention. It was also that 75% majority required to pass proposals like the China one. At the 1975 AGM, the majority did vote in favour of removing Taiwan and instating China, 49 to 25, but it didn't pass as that isn't a 75% majority. This, as you can imagine, didn't sit well with the ABC, whose Secretary General Tae Gin-soo wrote a rather scathing letter to the IBF about it. However, the parts about voting and majorities isn't what's important. It is what he wrote in the final paragraph. The Standing Committee has therefore taken a decision in order to register the protests of the Asian countries to issue a directive to its members not to grant permission to any of their players to participate in any tournament or championships organised by the Badminton Association of England. This was quite the threat. With the ABC's incredibly large membership, having within it a lot of badminton's strongest nations, and the BAOV running all the strongest tournaments of the time, one of which was the most prestigious, the All England, this wasn't a threat that could be taken lightly. And as it transpired, this threat was all too real, and with it the badminton world became even more divided than ever, leaving not just its Olympics hopes hanging on by a thread, but its whole future as a sport.